Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erica. And before we start, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or stream us on Spotify and on YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we've got a good one today, that's for sure.
Oh my God, All My Worlds Colliding, a play
right?
about Brian Epstein. Oh my God, I'm so happy.
So good. Yeah, this is a really fun one because today we're joined by playwright Tom Wright, whose new play, Please Please Me, brings the story of Brian Epstein to the stage at London's Kiln Theatre.
Tom Wright is currently the artistic director of Leeds Playhouse, and he spent years developing new work across the UK theatre scene with previous roles at Kiln Theatre and the Old Vic.
Yeah, and so in this conversation, we obviously talk a lot about Brian. We talk about what drew him to Brian, and Tom's own experience as a gay man, shaped his approach to the material, and how he navigates portraying a figure whose public success and private life were so often in tension with each other. And if you're in London or if you're around the UK and you want to see Please Please Me, it opens this week and is playing through May 29th. So go see it and let us know. We're trying to go see it. We want to see it really badly.
Might still happen.
Might still happen. Yeah, you never know. You never know.
If there's anything to take a quick random trip,
a jaunt
to over across the pond, this is it.
It was so much easier when I lived in New York. Now it's like a 12-hour flight from LA.
Oh, well, now I feel like I have to.
I know. For you, it's like you could go there and back, and it's like a day trip.
It might happen.
I think you should do it.
Maybe let's do it. I think you should come with me, but whatever.
I would love to. Oh my God, I would love nothing more.
Well, in the meantime, we'll have to content ourselves with this fabulous conversation with Tom Wright. Tom, thanks so much for being here on BC the Beatles. We're so excited to talk about Please Please Me.
It's really nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little about your background in the theater and what drew you especially to the character of Brian Epstein?
Well, Brian's much more interesting than me, so I'll whittle through the first part of that question. I grew up in a place called Coventry in the Midlands, in the middle of England. And none of my family work in theatre. That very much wasn't the vibe. But I was very, very lucky that my local theatre, the Belgrave Theatre Coventry, ran a youth theatre and basically visited my school. And that enabled me to get involved. And I was really taken by the arts, but particularly theatre. And I really wanted to be an actor. So my journey into the professional part of the industry was going to drama school to train to be an actor. But it wasn't quite what I wanted. And to be honest, I had a difficult time at drama school. And three things kind of really shifted. And this kind of leads to the play. I'm a gay man, so I knew I was gay at that time. I was out. And a teacher actually told me to take my earring out and act straight if I was ever going to get leading roles.
Oh my God.
Yeah, kind of horrific. I was told that my Midlands accent was a complete waste of time and I needed to speak with what we call royal pronunciation, a little posher. And I guess I was made to feel my class wasn't really welcome. And really that put a big old chip on my shoulder, probably much like the Beatles, to prove something. And I started working actor for a few years, but quite quickly started writing. And for me, writing was where all of those parts of me that I was told to deny as an actor actually could come forth and were what made my writing juicy and interesting and exciting and have flavor. My gayness, my class, my age, my background, all of that made my work more distinct. So quite quickly, I sort of shifted to writing rather than acting. And from that came directing, and then leadership. So right now I'm the artistic director of the Leeds Playhouse, which is a major institution in the north of England. But I used to work here at the Kiln, where I am right now, where Please Please Me is happening. So I'm really over the moon that a play of mine will be happening here, because I worked at the Kiln for about 5 years. First as the previous artistic director's associate, and now and then as Amit, who's the current AD and director of this play. So it's a real coming home to have a play on here, and I'm very excited. I was really lucky to be commissioned to write a play for this theatre. And I was trying to think of what story was right to tell. And all my work explores the LGBTQ experience in one way or another. And I was kind of really interested in the 60s as a time in England, just on the cusp of decriminalization, or the partial decriminalization of homosexuality in the UK. And it was interesting because there were gay men in this country who everyone knew were gay, who were able to be hugely successful, particularly in the entertainment industry. But it was still illegal. So there was this huge painful shadow of not really being able to be yourself. And I found that quite interesting. And Brian, of course, was a really huge example of that. He felt like the crystallization of that time. And I was talking about him a lot when I was pitching the idea as an example. And he actually was in my head because as an actor, as I said, I was actually in a show about the Beatles. I played Ringo Starr in a musical about the Beatles.
Oh my God.
I knew, and so it was kind of full circle. So I researched the Beatles a lot at the time to play Ringo. And of course, Brian was in my head from that. So yeah, I talked about Brian a lot. And it was the previous artistic director, Indu, who said, you need to write Brian's story. That's what you should do. And I have to admit, I was a bit resistant at first because I'm not a historian. I usually write fiction. Fiction that's based on truth, emotional truth, but always then fictionalized and put in characters that aren't real. So I was a bit nervous about it. But she rightly said, this could be a way to reach new audiences. So many people are fascinated by the Beatles, about Brian. And actually, we can take your artistic voice, which has a queer sensibility, which has a really clear perspective, and marry it with this idea or this person that is really well loved by all sorts of people. And it will take your voice to a broader audience. So I'm so glad she pushed me, because I feel like the play is in the end doing that. But it's been a long ride and taken a long time to get right.
When did you start writing it?
I think probably 4 years ago. Obviously, I wasn't writing it all that time. I was doing different projects, but I think that conversation probably was about 4 years ago. So there was a lot of research at first, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. And some of it was going over what I learned and understood when I was in that Beatles show. But now I was really drilling in on Brian. And the more I learned about him, the more I became certain actually, I definitely was meant to tell his story. And particularly as a gay man living now, I felt like I saw aspects of his personality that either aren't talking about at all or just aren't usually the subject of so much attention from the Beatles biographers. So I thought my particular lens on him might illuminate something new.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also a lot of similarities in your story to Brian's. Brian went to RADA to be an actor, didn't pursue that path. He didn't become a playwright, obviously, but he chose another path. And then, he changed his accent to be a little bit more posh. And, so I think there was a lot there that makes sense to combine the two of you.
I have to be really careful comparing myself to Brian, because if only I had an ounce of his genius. But
I know.
The more, I guess, anytime you get to know a character, the more I wrote, the more I did see parallels. And I was the age Brian died when I first started writing the play. And in a way was going through something very interesting in my life. I was going sober. And I was also having quite a lot of career success, but also realizing that it didn't quite fulfill in quite the way that I thought it would. Not that I wasn't grateful, but that if I was using work to fill something else, that wasn't going to work. So I went on this moment of change where, I went sober. I was sort of exploring my sense of spirituality. And in a way, these are things that Brian, at the end of his life, didn't feel he had access to. He didn't feel like he could, stop the drugs he was taking, the alcohol. As the Beatles found the Maharishi and sense of spirituality, he didn't feel, for many reasons, it seems to me that he felt excluded by that. So I felt this privilege that I, being born the time that I had access to tools that Brian didn't, which again, I think finds its way into the play in interesting ways.
Where do we meet Brian in the play? Where do you start? There's so many points that you could have chosen. So where do we see him first?
Well, hopefully in a place you don't quite expect. I think the marketing of the play and what we know of Brian, you think of him as this genius. And whilst we know we're probably going to go to the beginning of his story, but when he was opening or running the record store. But I guess because my play is particularly interested in his experiences as a gay man, as a gay Jewish man, and how that impacted the choices he made with the Beatles, I wanted to really launch that theme from the very beginning. And I became a bit fascinated and interested by this blackmail incident that happened when he was quite young. He was cruising at the docks, met a man to have sex, but was robbed and then blackmailed. And one of the interesting things about it, and again, this is all from my research. I know you are, I'm a huge Beatles fan, so if I got anything wrong, forgive me. But the case went to court and Brian was testified and was granted anonymity in order to move that case forward. And I found that quite amazing. Therefore, his family knew that he was gay from a very early age in a time of criminalization. So I was trying to find a way to dramatize that. So the first scene of this play, he's working in the store and the blackmail and that character, everything happens in the shop. So there's this really explosive scene where we establish him as a salesman, establish his relationship with his father, and then in comes this missile that's about to blow his sort of life up, really. And seeing the shame and the pain of his father finding out not only what he's done to fall in this blackmail situation, but also that he's been arrested before for cruising in London when he was at drama school. And all of this secrets start coming out. And for me, that's an important part to land on, because we see him before he became a genius. We see the scar really that's inflicted on him. And for me, that wound is part of what drives him for the rest of his life. So it feels like a useful place to start. I think we start with something we don't quite expect. And as a dramatist, as a playwright, you're always looking for ways to bring the action onto the stage. So we don't want to hear characters just talking about something we don't see. Ideally, we want to see it. So I wanted to bring Brian's sex life. I wanted to bring the blackmail. I wanted to bring the family shame into the scene. And it's a really explosive start. So I hope audiences are going to enjoy that.
Oh, I bet. And another thing I noticed was that John Lennon is the only character in your play that's from the Beatles. And obviously John has an outsized significance in Brian's real life story. So how are you approaching the relationship with John in the play?
The more I read, the more I just became fascinated with their relationship. And I think it's so juicy and rich and full of dramatic potential. They obviously meant a great deal to each other. Without each other, neither of them will have reached the heights that they did. I became particularly fascinated and I guess titillated by the myth of the holiday to Spain, which I'm sure you and your listeners know about. And of course, none of us are truly going to know what happened on that holiday. And for those who don't, a few weeks after John had his first child, rather than, I don't know, looking after the child with Cynthia, he's on holiday with Brian, touring the gay bars of Torremolinos and being shown the ropes of how it works as a gay man in Spain. And I found that fascinating. And John admitted at the time, of course, that he enjoyed exploring the gay world as an artist, that he was sort of vicariously taking that in. And so many people essentially, mocked him coming back. And of course, he punched and hospitalized Bob Wooler for taking the mick. And I just thought, well, he's protesting a little too much there for my liking. Yeah. He's obviously got under his skin. And I believe later in life joked, and again, this is just from research, whether this happened or not is up to people to decide. But I know Philip Norman's upcoming book about Brian mentions this quote that when asked about sleeping with Brian, he said, I had to do it twice. Once to see what it was like, the second time to make sure I didn't like it. And it's so hard to know if that's John being John and joking or whether it really happened. Yeah. But it certainly was full of dramatic potential. And again, I was sort of seeing it through the lens of my own experiences. Certainly earlier in life, there were straight men, younger straight men, similar of age to me, that saw me as a sort of tool of exploration because I was supposedly a confident sort of out gay man. And I could really imagine how that went down. There was so much at play between them on that holiday. John thinks Brian has all the power, as well as the anonymity of not being famous, and that he has too much control over him. At the same time, John's probably has a sense that Brian desires him or at least adores him and has this pull over Brian. And there's class at play. There's the fact that John's losing his freedom with a child and the band. But at the same time, Brian is having to keep tightly in the closet. And the bigger the Beatles get, the more fear he has. So there's this interesting projection, I think, between both of them of they each have something the other wants. And maybe that led them to to have sex. Supposedly, that's what the myth said. So I just thought that's really, really juicy. And I can imagine if they did, that would have meant a lot to Brian and possibly slightly less to John, or who knows. But I think at least the play theorizes that that may have been a huge part of Brian's life and trajectory. And maybe whatever he had with John or other men, something he was then sort of searching for the rest of his life. So it felt important to include John in that way. But one of the interesting things of the play also, though, is that we delay John's entrance. We sort of play with the myth of John, because I knew an audience would be really desperate to see a real Beatle. Yes, Brian's brilliant, but they're going to want to see a Beatle. We only have John, as you say, and that really makes him distinct. I think it's sort of 4 scenes before we get John, and then we get a big old scene with John, the Spanish scene, just before the interval. So I found that quite interesting as well. And we hear about John so much from Brian, then from Aunt Mimi, from Scylla, from Cynthia. So we build up this sense of John. Of course, we already have our own sense. And then we have this, well, the first time we see him is in Spain, playing these power games with Brian. So I guess I had that anticipation in my mind and thought, okay, this is a play, this is not a film. How do we use what theatre can do to kind of do something interesting with him?
And that's so fascinating that you've got all of these John adjacent characters kind of encircling the moment. I always think about how much that must have meant to Brian. It must have been so confusing, yet so meaningful to him.
I think when Brian starts working with the Beatles, he almost for a while tries to suppress his sexuality and his desire. You know, he knows he has to be impeccable as a gay man if he's going to lead them to success. And then here's the thing, that's the love that's so closest to him, that's so crucial for that plan, potentially offering himself in some way. I mean, that must be so, so difficult to resist. And at the same time, I think he knows that would change their relationship forever. It's quite a powerful moment for Brian, I think.
So we're talking, about these characters, and you probably had a really unique challenge in actually taking real people and transforming them into characters for the stage. What was the challenge of that? Making them multifaceted, real people, but, we know, like John Lennon, we know him as a Beatle. We know Scylla as, Scylla as the singer or the television presenter.
Blind Date, yeah.
Yeah, a Blind Date, there you go. But yeah, so was that challenging?
Yeah, it was interesting. As I say, it was sort of the first time I did it. And I think it pivoted between challenging and useful at different points. The benefit is there's so much material about these people. So you can research and find details and nuances that are like, great, that's how they speak. Or you can watch videos and get a sense of the words, the kind of words they use and the intonations. And then at the same time, you have to try and breathe new life into them. They can't just be using words that they've gone on record saying. Otherwise, everyone who's read the books will be like, well, I've heard all this. I think one of the useful things about this play is because I was interested in Brian's gay life and his experiences as a queer person, so much of that is undocumented through necessity because it was illegal. So we just don't know how it went down at many points. A lot of people in interviews say, well, Brian never talked about his sexuality. I'm sure he did to someone, maybe not to the straight people in his life, but two characters that feature quite heavily in the play, Jeffrey Ellis and Peter Brown, both gay men who he was friends with for his whole life. Now, I would hugely doubt the fact that they never talked about their sexuality or their desires behind closed doors. Now, we don't know because there's no record or there's little record. So the use of that was that in that gap, I was allowed to be a bit more free because we don't really know. And because of that, the play is a little bit impressionistic. It's my impression of how that must have gone down, projecting or trying to fill those gaps with my understanding of particularly psychology of gay men and research. So that was a bit of a gift in a way. We're straying off the Beatles map of what we know and into something we don't know. But I do hope we've shown the characters in a slightly different light because of that. And there's a reason to explore them once again.
And how are your actors approaching that, especially with John, Cynthia? So they've got these impressions in their minds. I'm sure they have to think about their own interpretation versus what the public might expect to see when they're coming to the play. So how are they exploring the characters?
Well, we're really lucky. We've got an amazing cast. They are really sensational and they're all so unique and interesting in their own ways. I think viewing their process from the outside, they had to also sort of catch up with all the research. And of course, they had their own impression of the characters and they tried to read and understand as much of what they were really like. And then I think as an actor, you have to slightly let go of that ultimately and trust that that will infuse the way you perform. But you have to kind of let go into an emotional truth or being in the moment. So loads of research, then sort of letting go of the research and finding the truth in it. And then actually now we're sort of doing run-throughs. I think we can now put some of the reality of who they were back in. And it's not that the actors should be doing impressions, but because they now have the emotional truth, we're now layering back in, okay, but they also were a little bit like this in the body or the voice. We also have an amazing movement director, an amazing voice coach. So there's a lot of people sort of supporting them and giving them feedback to be really like the characters. But I think they've got it. For me, they've hit a note of, it's obvious who they are. And you instantly go, oh gosh, that's Scylla, that's brilliant. But hopefully then you kind of forget that and you're just kind of with them and the truth of the character as well. So hopefully we've achieved that.
Yeah. And, you brought up Peter Brown and Jeffrey Ellis, who are maybe a little bit less familiar to audiences, but were obviously super important to Brian. How did you really decide which people to include?
Well, I think because I was being so focused on the experiences Brian had as a gay man, that again helped me choose who's important in that storytelling. So I knew John was, clearly. And then it struck me interesting that he had these two friends who didn't necessarily like each other, but they were around Brian's life from very young. And then actually the weekend he died, he was with Peter and Jeffrey in his house in Kingsley Hill the weekend he died. So that struck me as something that was interesting. Here are these two other gay men who were around for the whole time and there near his end. So I kind of started to see that they must be important figures. And what they gave me was an opportunity to have different dimensions on the gay male experience at that time. So we're not just seeing Brian, we're seeing two other men and how they experience it. And luckily they were so different. I think you only have to look at the titles of their books to see that. I think Peter's, if I'm correct, is something like The Love You Make.
Yes,
it is.
And meanwhile, Jeffrey is I Should Have Known Better.
That's so true. I never thought of it like that, but you're so right.
So it's fantastic. I was like, this is brilliant. And, Jeffrey strikes me as someone who was slightly more conservative. He didn't really like the Beatles music. He had a sort of sense that to fit in with heteronormativity was the way to succeed. Peter, I know slightly less about his sort of political view in that way. And of course, Peter's still alive. I haven't been able to speak to him, but he was a different class background and knew Brian in a different way. So they both allowed me different lenses on that. And then I also knew I wanted to bring other gay men into it, and particularly working class gay men, because that felt interesting to me because Brian, of course, had a lot of his challenges, but he was essentially middle class. He was fairly affluent. He had some privileges, but the men he desired supposedly weren't that. So I soon realized actually bringing in some of his lovers could highlight that in an interesting way. So we meet, trying to remember now, at least two of his lovers who I've sort of invented that are sort of based on people that he really did have connections with. So that's how I made the choices. And then, of course, I really wanted to make sure women were in the piece. A lot of work about gay men either doesn't have women in it. And in a way, maybe that's not okay. But, gay male stories are still slightly underrepresented in media. So you can't do everything in one play. However, I like to have diverse casts. I like to include everyone. And that provides another sort of look at the era that, yes, it was illegal to be gay, but it also wasn't particularly easy to be a woman. And allows Brian a way to express himself in a way that he can't potentially with other characters. So I knew I wanted Scylla. I mean, how gorgeous is Scylla? And that would be amazing. But I wanted different female perspectives, like I had Jeffrey, Peter, and Brian. So Aunt Mimi jumped out to me as a different kind of woman, someone who was, everything that Aunt Mimi supposedly was. And also Cynthia, and how Cynthia and Brian both loved John. And what was their relationship like? And Brian had a lot of control over Cynthia, and it actually allows us to see Brian in a slightly different light where we're like, I'm not sure this is okay, actually, forcing her behind the shadows and all of that, especially if he desired John, and how that must have gone down. So in the end, we brought these three very different women, and the same actress plays all of them. She's incredible, and she has different wigs and costumes. And I think that really allows us to see another angle on the times and some of the challenges of the times.
That's an actor journey, going from Aunt Mimi to Scylla in one play.
Yeah, and then Cynthia, and actually they're back-to-back scenes. So,
oh my God, oh my gosh, what a challenge.
And she looks totally different. I mean, the design team has done an incredible job. And I knew, again, because I see so much theatre, I know what's interesting as an audience. And I thought, well, that's going to be just really fun that they're back to back. And maybe even we see her change the wig, and maybe there's a wig reveal, a wig under a wig. I thought, all that's going to be really fun. If they could do it on RuPaul's Drag Race, we could do it on the stage.
There you go.
God, yes.
And actually, in our play, you don't see her change in the end, but you do see her go off and then come on looking totally different. And you're like, wow, okay, she's transformed. And then it happens again. So that's all part of the magic.
Wow, that's amazing. And so one character that I noticed is included, and as you just talked about, you wanted to include a couple of Brian's lovers, but this character of Diz, Diz looms large in Brian's legend in general as the person who, blackmailed Brian later in his life, who really sort of emotionally abused him in a lot of ways. Some people say physically too. So what kind of care was taken to portray that relationship fairly? Sometimes I feel like certain TV shows, movies have Brian was a victim in the situation, but they use it to sort of create this victimization of Brian when I feel like it should have been more of a show of Brian's vulnerability, if that makes any sense. So I guess when you are creating these moments, like you said, the play opens with him being blackmailed by someone he was cruising with, or you have this Diz character. What kind of care was taken to make sure the story was told fairly and accurately?
Yeah, I think the kind of theatre that I love is where all perspectives are argued with equal passion, even the ones we disagree with, or the characters we might find we dislike. I think we have to fight their case just as hard as the characters we believe are right. So an audience is left with this really complicated, juicy presentation of ideas, and then can decide for themselves what they think, rather than being told, this is the bad person, this is the good person, etc. So I hope in the way we've represented Diz, we try and he's only in one scene, but we try and give some understanding of where he's coming from, that it's a bit more complicated than he's someone who potentially was abusive to Brian. And I don't think it's that simple. I mean, there are all these stories that Brian was beat by his lovers. And this is complicated because none of us really know how that went down. And while obviously domestic abuse is awful, and if it was that, then that's terrible. But in the queer world, kink is a thing. And sometimes that's consensual. Now, obviously, some people might feel that violence can never be consensual. I totally get that as well. But in some of my plays, I have tried to explore kink and the psychology of kink. So I think at least sometimes that is what my take is, that is what Brian wanted. Whether that was good for him or not is TBC. So when Diz does get violent in this play, it's sort of a bit more complicated than Diz is just beating on Brian. It's sort of invited, sort of not invited. And ultimately, in the scene that I placed them on, it's a scene where Brian is trying to convince Jeffrey to come and work at NEMS, to come back from America and work with him. So in a way, I think Diz, trying to figure out what is it Brian wants so I can ensure that I stay in his life, identifies that what he wants right now is Jeffrey to come back, and starts to sort of fall into the role of being the manipulator, being the violent one, to scare Jeffrey into saving Brian and coming back. And it kind of works. So the way I played it is that Brian and Diz are almost working together in that play. And again, I don't know if that ever happened, but it's something that does happen in our psychology. So trying to look for the drama in each of those moments. But yeah, I hope that I've fairly sort of represented each character in a way that no one gets off lightly, including Brian. He's not just the hero of the story. He's a tragic hero in a way.
Yeah, he was a very complex person for sure. With the temper. People talk about his temper a lot.
That's true.
And again, we don't know really what happened. So we have to sort of imagine. But I do think it's a little bit more complicated than black and white. And, there's some theories that our early sexual experiences sort of fuse a little bit of what our taste is. So if your first sexual experiences are by necessity, really, cruising at a dock and sometimes being blackmailed and beaten up, I could see how that might fuse an interest in that, which could then be played out safely sometimes and not so safely in others. But of course, again, because it was illegal to be gay, all those connections are always laced with some danger. But danger is sometimes exciting. Even now, we see gay men today putting themselves in dangerous situations all the time. So there's a lot of Brian's psychology that's still being played out, even though it's not illegal to be gay. And again, that's what drew me to the play. It's like, what can Brian's story help us understand about ourselves right now?
And stepping back to the wider picture, what do you see as Brian's cultural significance, both within the Beatles story and beyond it as an individual in his own right?
I think a couple of things. I mean, we're at a time where we're sort of looking back in history and checking we didn't miss anyone, through the predominant gaze and the lens that has told history, that there are all sorts of figures, be those gay people, black people, women, that have been overlooked in history. And we're sort of reclaiming them and saying, wow, this person did amazing. So there's something about telling his story that's sort of celebrating his brilliance and making sure he is part of history, because he had such a huge role to play in the Beatles' success. And it's only really recently that he's getting his flowers, as it were. He didn't get the MBE for the Queen like the Beatles did. And I think it was only a few years ago, there was a statue of him sort of unveiled in Liverpool. So there's a bit of like making sure people know about Brian and that he's part of Beatles history, but also as a gay person, he's one of our sort of legendary forefathers that deserves being known about. And at the same time, I don't think, personally, I don't create works of art as sort of museum pieces. They have to have a reason to be told right now. And that's where his psychology, I think, comes important to me, because we live in a time where, while our rights as queer people have never been better, although saying that, that could change at any moment and the political tides could make that more difficult. At the same time, certainly in the UK, but many other places, including the US, there's such a high rate of suicide with gay men, a huge high rate of addiction, of sexual assault, of abuse, of homophobia. So I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in trying to contribute to understanding why that is. And that's where Brian's story and seeing the familiar patterns of this, a feeling of a lack, and then the feeling that we need to overachieve or hyperextend ourselves to feel okay, to feel accepted, that it's not enough to be like the norms, as Brian calls them in the play, but we actually have to be exceptional. But what does it mean when being exceptional drives you to take more drugs than anyone else, to have more sex than anyone else, to be so much better? It drives you to an early grave. So I think there's also a bit of a rallying cry with telling Brian's story, that this is still going on in some ways, and asking the question, how are we going to heal? How are we going to not continue this pattern that starts with Brian, goes through Joe Orton, Oscar Wilde, all these amazing artists that have in some ways acted self-destructively.
How did you land on the title, Please Please Me?
Well, there were a few titles. It wasn't the original one. I think I started by calling it A Cellar Full of Boys, which you might know is what John Lennon suggested his biography was called, A Cellar Full of Noise, before saying it should be called something else, which is both homophobic and anti-Semitic. So I was interested in that for a while. And it was actually a mentor of mine, an amazing person called Ricky Beadle Blair, who suggested Please Please Me. And I think it's a great title for a few reasons. I mean, it's the name of the record that really hit the fame, and a lot of the play is building up to that moment and what they were celebrating in Spain. But at the same time has the double meaning, of course, that Brian has this sort of insatiable desire for John for something that needs to be solved, or he's on a quest to resolve. And I like the Please Please Me. There's a desperation, there's a and then it works well because I think Beatles fans instantly know that it's a Beatles show, whereas I think A Cellar Full of Boys is a little bit less distinct. So I'm pleased that we settled on that.
It's great. And the Beatles themselves, they had the double entendre too. They would kind of snigger about what it was really about and all that. So it's kind of fun to have the layering there. So when audiences come in after seeing the play, especially for people who maybe they don't know much about Brian or they've heard about him, what would you like them to come away with from the experience of the play?
Yeah, so it's our first preview tonight. So I'm
Ooh,
literally about to have the audience
Congratulations.
experience in about an hour's time. I will
Oh my
find
God.
out what everyone makes of it. What do I want? I want them firstly to have a really brilliant night. I think theatre should never feel like medicine. I really hate when people say, "Oh, I know I should go to the theatre more." I'm like, well, you shouldn't have to do anything. I want you to really want to and to have an amazing time. So I'm always trying to write something that's really, really entertaining. So I hope they're really gripped and just entertained by the play, but also challenged in sort of equal measure. I hope that if they're a Beatles fan, they will have learnt a slightly different perspective or angle on the story that they know so well, and maybe parts of Brian and the Beatles story that they didn't know, that sort of queer history behind this legendary band. But I think if people don't know anything about Beatles or Brian, then they're going to be hopefully drawn into seeing some of that brilliance. And then coming away, yes, with the recognition of who Brian was and his important place in our history, but also with these questions about society and acceptance and love and desire that still ring true today. Hopefully they're the conversations that people will have in the bar afterwards. And I know everyone's going to be Googling to find out what's true, what's not true, which we had a dress rehearsal today. And in the interval, because we end after the Spain scene, and you can imagine how the scene ends, I could see everyone Googling John, Brian, Spain. And of course, they'll see the rumors straight away and go, okay, I didn't know that, because so few people know about that holiday.
So when you're researching this play, first of all, was there anything that surprised you, researching and writing the play? But also, did you use any portrayals of Brian in popular culture, recently Midas Man, but also The Hours and the Times, which is specifically about that trip to Spain, and Scylla, which we love, the miniseries. It's one of our favorite
Love
things.
that.
And, there have been books. Obviously, you referenced Philip Norman's upcoming book. So yeah, I guess the question is, did anything surprise you in your research, and what part did these popular culture portrayals play in your sort of shaping of Brian?
Well, I tried to research as much as I could, particularly their biographies, autobiographies. But I did try and avoid the fictional tellings because I needed to find my sort of own voice and own perspective on it. And it would be it's hard because when you see someone else's telling of something, you might start to assume that that's how it happened. And then you have to include it when actually they themselves have taken the artistic license. So you're trying to go back to the root as much as you can. But I think the thing that did surprise me was that it's sort of impossible to get to the real root, that because it's the first time I'm writing about a real person. Like history, facts are objective, but history is kind of subjective, I think, that there are certain things that happened or didn't happen. But how we read into those facts is really imbibed with who we are and how we see the world, and what we know of human experience is how we see the history. So when I was actually interviewing some of the historians, it really fascinated me how looking at the same facts, we both saw different things. And, it just so happened that most of the people I met, I believe, were straight men of a certain age. So they're going to have a certain perspective. And I'm not saying my one's right, but I found it interesting that they sometimes missed things that I thought, oh, well, I know how it would feel on that night, or I know how it would feel to experience that sort of rejection or that sort of passion. And as much as I said to some of my interviewees, look, I'm specifically interested in his experience as a gay man, they would love to go off on tangents about other things. And I thought, oh, okay, yeah, they're just not interested in that. And that's fine. But I really am. So I'm going to have to figure this out myself. So I think that's what surprised me, sort of learning about both the objectivity, but the subjectivity of history, which sort of gave me permission to write in a way that I hadn't written before.
Yeah, you're so right about that. And I think within the Beatles world specifically, I always say that Paul and Ringo are kind of the worst historians of their own story. They're the worst keepers of the facts because things change over time. And, but at the same time, it's like the historians, none of us were really there. So it is kind of, like you say, getting to the root of like, okay, what happened, and what, in your case, what was maybe Brian's emotion around it? What was the colorful part of it? So I can totally see that.
And you can pick that any part of his life, even the end of his life, which is obviously a sad part to zoom in on. I was really struck by how close his dad's death was to his own.
Yeah.
And the fact he sat shiver in Liverpool with his mum. And I know I lost my dad when I was really young. So I sort of know what it's like to lose a father, particularly as a gay man, whether you've gained the acceptance or not, and the end of that story coming sooner than you'd like. And also there's a feeling, I think, often as queer people, when we go home to heteronormativity, I love it. You love it for a bit, and then you really need to get out of it and back to people that are like yourself. So I kind of saw that in him, because he went, from sitting shiver with his family to this big gay weekend. I think he said he was hot for something good with Jeffrey and Peter. And again, I just felt like, yeah, that makes total sense. I think the morning after my dad's funeral, I was like so keen to get a train back to London, and I wanted to cruise. I wanted to have sex. And for many people, death and sex is something that weirdly gets sort of mixed up, because we want to feel alive. So, and you could say, oh, I'm just projecting all my own thoughts onto Brian, and that's probably true. But it did seem to tally. And, he hoped that Simon Napier Bell was going to come to the Kingsley Hill, and he fixed possibly too much hope on this new love interest. And then it turns out that he can't come. And again, the disappointment of that, having just lost your father, you want a good weekend with your friends, you've got a love interest coming, and now they're not coming, particularly when you already feel such a sense of rejection. It was just like, gosh, yeah, I really know these emotions, or a version of these emotions, which hopefully means that there's an emotional truth to the end of that story that might feel fresh.
Is his death part of your play?
We go up to his death and slightly beyond it, because there was a challenge then of how do we end this play? Because a biopic film maybe would end at his death. But there's something about theatre, and because we can't see his death, on a play, it's kind of hard to see that. So, and I was also really mindful as a gay man who goes to see a lot of theatre about our experiences. There's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of tragedy, and Brian's story is tragic, but I didn't want to end on that note. So the play has a scene at Kingsley Hill. We see Brian drive off to London, and through sound of movement, we understand that something tragic happened, but we don't see it. But there is another two scenes. We hear from Scylla speaking at his memorial, which gives a perspective on his finish. But then there's a sort of scene that I've described as being beyond time and space. If you're coming to see the play and don't want a spoiler, stop listening now. But there's a moment where John is just come out of the retreat he was on when he found out about Brian's death. And there's this famous interview where he's being interviewed by Derek Bellis, and he just seemed so out of it to me in that interview. And obviously he's just been meditating and found out this news. I was interested in where his mind was going. And he says, when Derek asks, what did the Maharishi advise you? And he said, well, to keep the thoughts positive, because they might travel to Brian wherever he is. So my play imagines that is possible, and that interspersed with him trying to respond to Derek, he somehow, through meditation, through what the Maharishi believes, is able to communicate to Brian. And there's a conversation between the two of them that could never happen, and depending what you believe about the afterlife, but that maybe offers some hope, some resolution, or just a different emotional flavor than ending on Brian's death, and gets to see that, yes, he died tragically, but he had a lot to be proud of. And that even though his love for John was never quite fulfilled in the way that he may have wished, it was still a beautiful love affair that drove such amazing events and gifts to the world. So there's a lot to celebrate as well. And by giving them a moment, I hope we allow ourselves to do that.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. So first preview tonight, and when's the opening night?
So we've got preview tonight, and I think we've got a sort of week's worth of previews. So a week today will be the opening night, the press night, and then the show's on the road.
Oh my God, that's exciting. Runs through May, right, at the Kiln?
Yes, through April through May. It's just recently been extended, but is pretty much sold out, which is amazing. I think it's the fastest selling play in the Kiln's history, which is incredible. So if you do want to come along, you've got to book quick.
Okay, we need to make the decision. We've been talking about this. Like,
we've been talking about coming over.
Let's just do it.
Oh my God, that would be amazing.
I love that. So April, May with an extension. And where can people follow you and your work?
So if you want to come see the play, it's at the Kiln Theatre. The website's kilntheatre.com. Tickets while they last. If you can't see the play and you want to read it, the play text has been published. So the script of the play has been published and is available in all good bookstores. I know you can get it through the publisher's website, which are Bloomsbury. But also it's usually in sales in Waterstones or some of the theatrical bookshops in New York or wherever you're based. And you can get it on Amazon. So you could also read the play if you search Please Be Tom Wright. On socials, I'm at TDWright1. Mostly use Instagram. I used to use X, but not so much now. But I've also recently become the AD of Leeds Playhouse. So a lot of my work will be happening up in Leeds. So if you are in the UK and want to check out my next play after Please Please Me, that will premiere up in Leeds next year.
Oh, that's exciting. And you were with Kiln when Two Strangers Carry a Cake Across the City.
Yes. Okay, what an amazing show.
That's so big in New York here right now. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, Kiln is a real powerhouse. It has been for a while now, and hopefully, it definitely will continue to be. So if you're in London and you haven't come to the Kiln Theatre, you must check it out. It's some of the best new work in the world. It's incredible.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, and congratulations. All the fingers and toes crossed for your preview tonight. And folks, you should check out Please Please Me if you're in London or if you need to take a trip to London like we do.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much to Tom, and thanks again for listening to BC the Beatles. Don't forget, Please Please Me opens this week, plays through May 29th. As always, subscribe to BC the Beatles on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.